test. Radio. Magic. Yeah, is it a bit too much rustling? Right. No, it's about pretty much everything. Balena. It is about Balena mostly, yeah. But there will be demos inside that are not Balena, yeah. I'm pretty much ready, yeah. Okie dokie. So, let's get on the screen. I am a noob, it says. So, everything to say, take it with a bit of a grain of salt, because I'm not an embedded systems engineer, and I don't know that much, and I've only learnt most of it in the past year or two, okay? But I think it's really cool, so I wanted to talk about it a little bit. The slides are available at that link there, and my website is croughan.sh, or it will be. I only bought it before. So I talk to everyone about Docker. I talk to my mum about Docker, and I talk to my sister about Docker, and they don't care. They pretend to care. And I wonder how many other people also pretend to care. But it is really cool, and I'd like to show you a little bit about how it works. Now let's get started with it. But before we talk about Docker, we're going to talk about Balena, because Balena is a fork of Docker that implements a bunch of features that are really nice. So Balena does things for you. Balena will remove many steps to deploying a system. Does anyone want some tea? Because this kettle pretty much proves the point that I'm trying to make. Because in this kettle, you just put the tea leaves in the top, and it boils the tea leaves. Zooming in on it. What's that? So before you know it, the kettle's going to start spewing hot red tea leaves into the water. And that saves me from having to have a kettle and a tea bag to get rid of, and other utensils in the kitchen like a spoon. And so now I've just got the kettle and the tea leaves, and everything happens there magically. Similar, in fact, to having to use Raspbian and then flash that to an SD card, put it on a Pi, and then SSH into it, and then do a bunch of steps manually with your fingers. And so you don't have to do any of that with Balena, and I'm going to show you how that's true. So, the first thing about Balena, the first thing it does for you is that it switches over the logging to RAM. So all of the stuff that is usually done by systemd, for example, journalctl-f, and then you'll be able to see all your logs in your system. All of that is put into RAM so that it doesn't thrash the SD card with writes. I don't honestly know how to do that on Raspbian. I wouldn't know how to do that in any other environment, but Balena does that for you. It puts a read-only root partition in so that if the device fails for whatever reason, typically, like for example, so you unplug the device randomly, it might corrupt the boot partition just because it wasn't read-only. And so this prevents that from happening, so the pi will at least always boot into the kernel, providing you've got a semi-working SD card. And you'll be able to diagnose that as a fact rather than it just quietly dying. It's also got a root A and a root B partition, because when Balena pushes updates to devices, it will try the root A partition first, and if that fails, then the root B partition is used as backup. And it simply works like that, and you don't need to get more complex than that to just have a redundant system. Additionally, a small VPN is established so that you can tunnel into your devices and do a bunch of things. For example, if you've ever used SSH for an SSH tunnel, then you'll know you can do a remote port forwarding where you say, okay, the port over there on that server, on port 80, for example, is port 5000 on my system locally. And then you'll be able to go to 127.0.0.1 or localhost :5000, then you'll be able to see what's on the remote server on port 5000. On port 80, on your local machine on port 5000. That's a bit complex, so I'll demonstrate that later, and it'll be really easy, I promise you. And container deltas. So container deltas are, let's say you've got a container for Nginx, and Nginx has a bunch of things in it, for example, the Nginx binary, configuration files, or maybe you've got some big web page, like, it's probably a bad example because HTML is not that big, but if you had a big web page that was like a gigabyte in size, and you didn't change that, and then you submitted an update to just the configuration file, you would see that the container deltas mean that it only changes the things that it needs to change. It doesn't, it's got like an algorithm that works that out so that you can just send updates and it will only change the things that need to be changed. It's also. So, you can make a theoretical machine in what's called a Docker file, which is basically just a bunch of text. It can be as simple as a 3-line text file that says, get Debian, install Nginx, and then run Nginx. It could be that simple. And I'm going to give you an example with that with not Nginx, but Mosquito, which is an MQTT broker later. So, you can push updates to devices, as I've already said. You can tunnel into devices, as I've already said. You can view the logs for those devices on the Balena dashboard or through the Balena CLI, which I'll also be showing you in a moment. And you can administrate large swarms of devices and centrally manage and deploy them. What I mean by that is you can take an SD card, plug it into your laptop, and instead of flashing Raspbian, you'll flash your own personalized distribution of Linux, essentially, that has been generated from a Docker file. It's not literally a Linux distribution, but that's what I ended up using it for, is just to make like a personal machine that has a bunch of things on it that I don't ever want to have to log down how I made them. And so Docker files are self-explanatory instructions to create a machine. So let's get into that. Right, so Balena is great, but you can't SSH in. Julian here often says this, Julian Todd, who's a member of the Makerspace, says that he doesn't like Balena because he can't SSH into the devices. He can't use it like a normal machine, he doesn't get it. And that's true. You do need to learn some new concepts in order to use this whole system. Things are not persistent by default. So let's say that you make a container and you've got a bunch of valuable stuff in it. All that stuff's going to disappear next time that you, not boot the device, but next time you build the device again. That's not going to be there. And I'll demonstrate some of those problems later. But very simply, you've just got to learn new concepts in order to do that. So you need to learn about containers, what a hypervisor is, or a supervisor, Docker files, and Git. And the Balena CLI, optionally, however, it is quite nice and easy to use. So I'll show you that soon. So, Balena is not the only way to do these things. You can use Hyper IoT. I think that's how it's supposed to be pronounced. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce that, but I'm just going to say it's Hyper IoT. What they do is they just simply take Raspbian, fork it, and then put Docker on it by default. And then you can just go into the device, pull your favorite Docker images, and then Docker up. That doesn't mean that you can push updates to the device. You'll have to SSH into that device every single time you want to update it. Say you've got 10 of them. You can't necessarily manage all of those devices all at once. Yeah, so it's a good idea, and I'll show some of the differences between using Balena, using Raspbian, and using Hyper IoT later. There's also Ansible, which Adrian, a member of the Makerspace, is really fond of, which some of you might know. And what that allows you to do is provision machines with SSH and only SSH in a bash-like language. And there's all sorts of abstractions and concepts inside of it. So that's another way of doing these sorts of things. Another way is debootstrap, which is also very similar to bash, except it is a more painstaking, masochist way of doing things, because there's, I don't want to say less documentation, but it's just generally less developer-friendly. You've got buildroot and Yocto, which are not necessarily ways of doing all of the things that I've talked about so far, but are ways of building a Linux kernel. And that could include, say, OK, I want this device to boot up and be a 3D printer. And you could do all of the steps that you need to do to make it into a 3D printer in these environments and build systems. And it's just a short summary if you want to read the slides later of what they do. The thing about Ansible, though, is that it is agentless. They call themselves agentless because it only requires SSH and nothing else. So if you've got a box sitting there doing nothing, you don't necessarily have to care what distribution of Linux it's running. You can just SSH into it, and then it'll try and run its like bash scripts or roles or things that it has to run on that target system. These are all just languages that can be learned in order to provision devices. So I've got a Pi, and I want it to become something. Like all of these things can do pretty much that. Balena is just another option for doing those things, and I happen to think it's really nice. So how do you do it? So I've already said this. So you imagine a concept for a device. I want this printer to run octoprint and boot up with a nice octo screen. And I just wanted to do that every single time. And I don't want to log in a wiki somewhere how I made that happen. I just want a file that does that on a target device. So you need to make